Time is supposed to be a river, a steady current carrying us forward from one moment to the next, linking yesterday to today and today to tomorrow. History, then, is the memory of that river, the record of every bend and ripple, the story of every storm and calm stretch that shaped its course. Yet when we look back, the river is not whole. There are places where the waters vanish, stretches where silence replaces sound, whole centuries where our connection to the past seems to dissolve, leaving us staring into gaps that should not be there. The first time you notice it, it feels like a misprint, a missing page in a book. You flip back, searching for the thread you must have missed. But it is not your eyes failing you. It is the record itself. The gaps are real, and once you see them, you cannot unsee them. Years without events, centuries without stories. A fog that drapes itself across the timeline, leaving us to wonder what really happened during those vanished years. Historians will tell you that silence is normal, that documents burn, that wars erase, that memories fade, and in many cases this is true. But then there are those other silences, the ones that do not feel accidental, the ones that stretch too far, linger too long, and seem almost designed to make us forget. These are the silences that haunt us. They whisper that time is not as solid as we believe, that our history may not simply be missing pieces but reshaped altogether. The so-called Dark Ages are one of the most famous examples. Centuries where Europe, once thriving under Rome, seemed to fall mute. Few records, few great works, few enduring monuments. As if humanity had suddenly stepped into a shadow and stayed there for hundreds of years. Then, just as abruptly, brilliance returns, architecture flourishes, knowledge blooms, kingdoms rise. But where in all that time was the heartbeat of progress? Did it truly fade, or was it quietly erased? It is not just Europe. The gaps appear everywhere, in the chronicles of Byzantium, in the dynasties of China, in the civilizations of the Americas, whose stories stretch back further than we ever admitted, then break off suddenly into silence. In Egypt, where dynasties seem to repeat or overlap in ways that do not add up. In the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, where the list of kings hints at missing epochs. Every culture has its shadow years, and together they paint a troubling picture. That history as we know it is not seamless, but patched together like an old garment, with whole sections cut away. Why would years be erased? Why would centuries be deleted? Some whisper that it was an accident of fire and war, knowledge lost to the chaos of time. But others believe it was deliberate, that rulers, kings, popes, and empires found power not just in shaping the present, but in reshaping the past, to stretch the timeline or compress it, to invent reigns that never happened, to add centuries where none existed, or to erase centuries that contained inconvenient truths. Because to control the story of time is to control humanity itself. These vanishing years are not just historical curiosities, they are wounds in our memory. They remind us that we are living in a story we did not write, that our ancestors may have lived through ages we no longer remember, that entire civilizations may have risen and fallen in the gaps, and that the truths buried in those silences could change everything we think we know. When you look back into the fog, when you stare into the blank spaces on the calendar, it is not just the past you are seeing. It is the shape of a question that still hangs over us today. Did we truly live those years? Or are we walking through a history edited to keep us in the dark? And so the river of time whispers as it flows, not just of what we remember, but of what we have lost. Not just of what survives, but of what was taken. And until we face those vanishing years, the gaps will continue to haunt us, like echoes from a forgotten age that refuses to be silenced. There are moments in history where the questions become louder than the answers, where the silence of missing centuries is not enough, and a far stranger idea takes its place. What if those years did not simply vanish? What if they never existed at all? This is the unsettling claim at the heart of what some call the phantom time theory, a suggestion so strange, so disorienting, that it unsettles even the most rational mind. According to this theory, somewhere in the flow of time, 500 years were not lost but invented. They were not lived by anyone. They were added to the calendar, written into our books, and taught as memory. In other words, the past we think we know may be a lie woven into the very fabric of time. The idea first emerged in whispers among scholars, where questions about chronology refused to be buried. In the 1980s and 90s, a German historian named Herbert Illig gave voice to what many had quietly suspected, that between the years roughly 614 and 911 AD, nothing really happened. The rulers, the battles, the events, all fabricated. In Illig's telling, the great emperor Charlemagne never existed. His empire, his victories, his legacy, nothing more than a shadow cast onto the timeline by those who stood to gain from rewriting the past. The implications are staggering. If phantom time is real, then we're not living in the year we think we are. Perhaps this is not the 21st century, but the 18th. Perhaps the present moment itself has been shifted forward by centuries of fiction. Imagine the weight of that realization. The dates on every coin, the foundation of every nation, the very structure of time, all adjusted to fit a story someone once wanted us to believe. How could such a thing be possible? Illig argued that it began with calendars. In the Middle Ages, the transition to the Gregorian calendar introduced adjustments meant to align dates with the heavens, but the mathematics of those changes left odd discrepancies, gaps in the records that seemed to suggest centuries had been artificially added. The evidence seemed to ripple outward, architectural styles that appeared out of nowhere with no development to explain them, documents suspiciously few in number as though written all at once, astronomical records that did not line up with where the stars should have been. But if the years were invented, who did the inventing? Illig and others pointed to powerful rulers with motives to reshape time itself. The Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, for example, who might have benefited from placing his reign at the symbolic year 1000, giving his empire an aura of destiny, or the papacy, which could anchor its authority more firmly by synchronizing prophecy and chronology. By creating time rather than merely counting it, these rulers could control the very heartbeat of history. Skeptics, of course, reject this theory outright. They point to records from China, from the Islamic world, from beyond Europe, all showing continuity across the so-called phantom centuries. They argue that coincidences and missing evidence do not add up to fabricated time. And perhaps they are right, perhaps. But even so, the theory lingers, because the gaps are real, because the silences remain, and because the thought that our very timeline could be tampered with refuses to fade. Whether true or not, phantom time haunts us because it touches something deeper than missing years. It reminds us how fragile history truly is. That every date, every event, every king or emperor we accept as real is ultimately just ink on parchment, just words repeated enough times to become truth. And if truth can be so easily constructed, what separates it from fiction? As you lie awake in the quiet, consider the possibility that 500 years of our past may never have been lived, that the men and women we think of as ancestors may be as unreal as characters in a play, that we are even now adrift in a version of history designed not by time but by power. And if that is true, then the question becomes unavoidable. What else has been invented? What other centuries have been stretched, compressed, or erased altogether? If 500 years can be conjured out of nothing, then perhaps our entire story is more fragile than we dare to admit. The calendar is one of the most ordinary tools in our lives. Days marked off in squares, months cycling in their rhythm, years stretching endlessly into past and future. We hardly ever question it. Yet hidden within those familiar numbers lies a disturbing truth. The calendar itself has been rewritten, not once, but many times. And each adjustment leaves behind shadows, opportunities for history to be bent, stretched, or cut away. To understand how, we must return to the reign of Julius Caesar. It was Caesar who introduced the Julian calendar in 45 BC, aligning Rome's days more closely with the sun. But the calendar was imperfect. Over centuries, small miscalculations accumulated, days drifting further and further from the heavens. By the Middle Ages, the calendar was off by nearly 2 weeks. Easter was no longer where it was supposed to be. Feasts and festivals fell out of step with the skies. The very rhythm of sacred time began to fracture. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII announced a correction. The Gregorian calendar, the one we still use today, was designed to bring order back to chaos. But in doing so, it deleted time. 10 whole days were cut away. People went to sleep on October 4th and woke up on October 15th. Those days were erased, unlived, forgotten, excised from memory by the stroke of papal decree. It was a surgical removal of time, done in the name of accuracy. But it demonstrated something chilling. The calendar, the very fabric of history, could be rewritten with a single command. What if such adjustments were not always so honest? What if some rulers saw not just inconvenience in the drifting days, but opportunity? If the Pope could delete 10 days, why could an emperor not invent centuries? If priests could bend time to fit prophecy, why could kings not mould it to suit their reigns? The calendar, after all, was more than numbers. It was a weapon, a way to anchor legitimacy in the heavens, a way to say, my empire exists now, at this destined moment, because time itself confirms it. This is where suspicion grows. The so-called phantom time years between 614 and 911 fall into the very era when calendar reforms, forgeries and adjustments were most rampant. Some claim that rulers like Otto III or even the Byzantine emperors may have manipulated chronology itself. By placing themselves at symbolic milestones, they were not just leaders of their age, they became leaders of history. Anchored at a year of destiny, their power gained an aura of inevitability. And yet, once the idea takes root, it spreads further. Could this explain why so many medieval documents feel like copies of copies, written long after the events they describe? Could it explain why certain architectural styles appear centuries before they should, or why astronomical records sometimes seem misaligned with their dates? If calendars were adjusted, shifted, or even invented, then the foundation of every timeline we accept begins to crumble. Skeptics argue that this is overreach, that calendar reforms were simply clumsy attempts at keeping time. But we cannot ignore the precedent. Time has already been cut, already been shifted, already been rewritten by those with the power to do so. The calendar is not a neutral tool, it is a construct, and like all constructs, it can be manipulated. Imagine for a moment that history is not a line, but a tapestry. Threads crossing, colours blending, patterns repeating. Now imagine scissors in the hands of a king, trimming here, adding there, weaving in false strands that look real enough to deceive the eye. When we look at the finished fabric, it seems whole. But beneath the surface, parts have been patched, stolen, or sewn out of place. The calendar conspiracy is not just about dates, it is about control. To decide what year it is to decide where we stand in the great story of humanity. And if that can be altered, then so too can the story itself. The year is more than a number, it is the stage upon which history plays. And once you can rewrite the stage, the actors, the script, and even the audience begin to follow. So we are left with a troubling thought. When we look at the date on a coin, a monument, or even our own calendars today, are we truly seeing time as it happened, or the version of time that someone once wanted us to believe? When the Roman Empire fell, its echoes should have lingered. Roads stretched across Europe, aqueducts carried water into cities, and libraries overflowed with knowledge collected over centuries. The collapse of such an empire should not have meant the end of light, only its scattering into smaller flames. And yet, according to the official story, Europe slipped into darkness. Centuries of silence. Centuries we now call the Dark Ages. This is where the puzzle begins. For nearly 500 years the record is thin. Few documents, few great works of art, few lasting monuments. Towns shrank, literacy declined, and progress seemed to halt. Then, suddenly, brilliance returned. Cathedrals rose, universities flourished, science blossomed, and kingdoms rebuilt themselves as though they had awoken from a long and dreamless sleep. But what if that silence was not simply decay? What if it was manufactured? The Dark Ages are one of the strangest intervals in history because they seem both empty and full at the same time. We are told of migrations, wars, plagues, and kings, but the evidence is curiously fragile. Entire dynasties rest on a handful of manuscripts copied centuries later. Battles of enormous scale leave little more than rumour. Even the great figure of Charlemagne, the so-called father of Europe, exists in a haze. His empire is described in glowing detail, yet the physical traces of it are strangely thin. Could an emperor so vast, a ruler so important, truly leave behind so little? Some historians whisper that the Dark Ages may not be what we think they are, that the silence is not the sound of collapse, but of construction, history being edited, stretched, or even invented. When monks and scribes copied texts in medieval scriptoria, they did more than preserve the past, they shaped it. A misplaced date, a forged chronicle, a deliberate insertion of names and battles could weave centuries into existence. The empty years could have been filled later, written not from memory but from imagination. Even the architecture tells a strange story. Buildings attributed to the High Middle Ages often appear centuries too advanced, rising with techniques that should not have been possible so soon after a supposed era of ruin. Styles emerge fully formed without the gradual development one would expect, as if the builders were not inventing anew but inheriting something older, something carried across the missing centuries. And then there are the silences beyond Europe. In China, in the Islamic world, in the Americas, stories continue, but with gaps that seem to align with Europe's missing centuries, as though the silence stretched its shadow across the globe, creating fractures in every timeline. The question is not whether the Dark Ages were dark. The question is whether they were even real. Were they a time of true collapse or a carefully crafted illusion? Were they centuries of shadow or centuries of invention stitched into the calendar to anchor rulers and empires to a false year? If the Dark Ages were manufactured, then history is not a river but a stage. Its curtains drawn and opened by the powerful, its actors written into existence when convenient. Perhaps Europe did not sleep for centuries. Perhaps those centuries never existed at all. And if that is true, then what else in our story has been written, erased, or rearranged? What other silences conceal not absence, but design? The Dark Ages puzzle remains unsolved, but its very existence forces us to ask the question that echoes through all of history: how much of what we believe is memory, and how much is invention? Charlemagne stands tall in the history books. The great king of the Franks, crowned emperor of the Romans in the year 800, remembered as the father of Europe. His empire stretched across much of the continent. His reforms reshaped law and culture, and his very name has become synonymous with the rebirth of the West after Rome's fall. He is celebrated as a colossus, the man who dragged Europe out of the Dark Ages and into light. But when we search for him, when we look for the evidence of his existence, something strange begins to emerge. Charlemagne, this mighty emperor, may be more ghost than man. Consider first the scale of his supposed empire. We are told that he ruled over modern-day France, Germany, Italy, and beyond. An empire of such magnitude would have required immense administration, records, coinage, and monuments. Yet what survives is curiously thin. Very few contemporary documents bear his mark. Coins attributed to his reign exist, but their authenticity is debated. Architecture credited to his era seems suspiciously advanced, more aligned with later centuries than with the time he supposedly lived. For an emperor so pivotal, the physical trace he left is shockingly faint. Much of what we know about Charlemagne comes not from his own time, but from accounts written generations later. The most famous biography, the Vita Caroli Magni by Einhard, was composed after Charlemagne's death in a style suspiciously modelled on Roman works. It reads more like a hagiography than history, elevating him to near mythic stature. Was Einhard chronicling the life of a real man, or creating the legend of a figure who had already grown larger in memory than in fact? Then there is the curious alignment with the phantom time hypothesis. Charlemagne's reign sits squarely within the disputed centuries between 614 and 911 AD. If those years never existed, then Charlemagne never existed either. He becomes the ultimate phantom, a king conjured to fill a gap, to anchor Europe's story to a calendar built on invention. Was he created to legitimize dynasties that followed, to provide a glorious founder where none had stood, to give shape to a past that rulers needed in order to control their present? Even the name itself feels strange. Charlemagne means Charles the Great. Yet Charles became one of the most common names among later European kings, as though retroactively echoing a legendary figure who might never have lived. Was the name repeated because rulers wished to link themselves to him? Or was he created precisely to provide that link, a foundation of greatness that others could inherit by name alone? Skeptics argue that there is enough evidence to confirm Charlemagne's existence. The fragments of documents, the scattered relics, the persistence of his legend across Europe. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps he was real. But even if so, the shadow remains. Was he truly the emperor described in glowing terms, or was his story stretched, embellished, even invented until the man was lost and only the ghost remained? The possibility that Charlemagne never existed is not just about one king. It is about how history itself can be manufactured. If a figure as monumental as the father of Europe could be a fabrication, then who else in our past might be less real than we think? How much of history's grandeur rests on the shoulders of phantoms? Stand before the monuments attributed to him, and you may feel it. That strange hollowness, the sense of a story too grand to be true. Charlemagne may have been a man, he may have been a myth, or he may have been nothing more than a name, a legend inserted into the silence of time to give Europe the illusion of continuity. A ghost emperor ruling over ghost centuries, haunting us still from the pages of history. The Byzantine Empire is often described as the bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds, an empire of shimmering mosaics, golden domes, and endless intrigue, ruled from Constantinople for more than 1,000 years. On the surface, it feels like one of the most documented civilizations of the past. Chronicles, records, and religious texts survive in abundance. And yet, when we look closer, the timeline of Byzantium begins to blur. Beneath the glitter of its history lies a riddle, one that may hold the key to understanding how entire centuries could have been invented, stretched, or erased. The Byzantine chronicles, for all their detail, carry strange inconsistencies. Whole reigns appear overly neat, their events echoing each other like stories copied and retold. Emperors rise and fall with suspicious regularity, many leaving behind little more than names on lists. Some reigns last only months, others decades, but the pattern feels less like lived reality and more like an artificial framework. A scaffold of history, carefully constructed to make time appear full. Consider also the architecture. Constantinople's greatest jewel, the Hagia Sophia, was built in the 6th century under Justinian. Its scale and brilliance were so immense that no structure rivaled it for centuries. Yet after this dazzling achievement, Byzantine architecture seems to stagnate. For hundreds of years very little compares, as though the empire itself froze in place. And then, suddenly in later centuries, artistic and architectural brilliance surges forward again. Why does such a vast empire appear to hold its breath for so long? The Byzantine riddle deepens when compared to other regions. The empire claimed to be Rome's heir, but its timeline does not always align cleanly with Western Europe's. Wars, treaties, and religious councils are recorded with dates that often conflict with those in neighbouring lands. It is as if Byzantium existed in its own stream of time, parallel, but not perfectly connected. Could this be evidence of chronology bent or altered, the empire's history stretched to fill centuries that may never have passed? Some researchers have even noted echoes between Byzantine rulers and Western monarchs, as though the same figures were being remembered twice under different names. Dynasties mirror each other, events repeat, and timelines fold back upon themselves. Are these coincidences or signs of deliberate duplication, a way to pad history with phantom centuries by recycling the past under new disguises? And then there is the silence. For an empire that supposedly lasted over a millennium, the number of surviving documents is surprisingly thin. Fires and wars destroyed much, yes. But could this also have been convenient? The Vatican and other custodians of knowledge had access to Byzantine records, and what they chose to preserve, or not preserve, may have shaped the version of history we inherited. Was Byzantine chronology smoothed over, rewritten to fit a larger narrative controlled by church and crown? The question lingers. Did Byzantium truly stretch across so many centuries? Or was its timeline expanded, inflated to fill gaps left elsewhere in history? If phantom years were added, Byzantium may have been the keystone, the glue binding together centuries that otherwise collapse into silence. By giving the illusion of continuity, it provided stability to a timeline that may have been fractured. To stand before the ruins of Constantinople today is to feel both awe and unease. The mosaics still gleam, the domes still rise, but behind their beauty lies a puzzle. Was the Byzantine Empire truly the long-lived guardian of civilization? Or was it partly a construction, its history edited and stretched to mask a forgotten truth? The riddle of Byzantium remains unsolved, but like so many gaps in history, it whispers a possibility. That time is not always what it seems. That empires may last longer on parchment than they did in reality, and that the story of Byzantium may conceal not just its own secrets, but the deeper secret of how time itself was rewritten. China's dynasties are often described as one of the most continuous records of civilization, a timeline stretching back thousands of years without interruption. Emperors rose and fell, dynasties burned and were rebuilt, and through it all, scribes faithfully recorded the deeds of rulers, the omens in the skies and the patterns of heaven and earth. To the modern world, China's chronicles seem to offer a seamless thread where the West falters, a history without the vanishing years that haunt Europe. But when we look closer, the thread begins to fray, and within those frays we find silences just as haunting, gaps that suggest the story of China may also have been rewritten. Chinese history is built on a principle known as the mandate of heaven. Dynasties claim legitimacy not just through bloodline, but through cosmic order. When floods struck, when famine spread, when rebellion broke out, it was seen as proof that the emperor had lost heaven's favor. A new dynasty would rise, and with it, new chronicles would be written. Yet here is where the cracks appear. Every victorious dynasty had the power to rewrite the past, to erase the failures of its predecessors, and to glorify its own rise. What survives, then, is not a neutral record, but an edited script, history sculpted by those who needed their rule to appear inevitable. In this process, entire decades sometimes vanish. Records of rebellions fade into silence. Wars described as devastating in one text are scarcely mentioned in another. Whole reigns of minor emperors are glossed over in a single sentence, as though their lives and struggles never mattered. Was this the natural erosion of memory, or the deliberate trimming of a story too inconvenient to tell? The gaps widen when we consider the astronomical records. For centuries, Chinese astronomers observed the skies with meticulous care, recording eclipses, comets, and planetary motions. These records should align perfectly with modern calculations of celestial mechanics. And yet, discrepancies appear. Eclipses dated to specific reigns sometimes do not match what the heavens would have shown at the time. Stars seem to be missing or misaligned. Could this be evidence that certain centuries were shifted or expanded, forcing the astronomical data to stretch in ways that no longer fit reality? Some scholars point to the period known as the Three Kingdoms and the subsequent dynasties as suspicious. The chaos of war and fragmentation supposedly consumed decades, yet archaeological evidence is patchy at best. Were these years exaggerated to create a grander narrative of collapse and rebirth? Was time itself lengthened, filling silence with stories written after the fact? And then there are the legends, myths of emperors who reigned for impossibly long lives, of golden ages stretching for centuries. These tales are usually dismissed as exaggerations, but perhaps they point to something deeper. Perhaps the blending of myth and history was not a mistake, but a deliberate tool. By weaving together fact and fiction, scribes could smooth over the fractures of time, creating a timeline that appeared whole even when pieces were missing. If Europe had its dark ages, China had its forgotten chronicles, years where the record thins, reigns blur, and dynasties seem to stretch longer than they should. And just as in the West, these gaps may not be mere accidents. They may be signs of chronology bent to the will of those in power, because to control the calendar was to control the mandate of heaven itself. If an emperor could claim to have reigned in a year that never was, his legitimacy became as solid as the stars his astronomers recorded. So we must ask, how much of China's seamless timeline is truth, and how much is embroidery? Were centuries invented to create continuity? Were failures cut away to hide the weakness of dynasties? Were the heavens themselves rewritten to keep the illusion of order alive? The chronicles remain, beautiful and detailed, but behind their surface lies a silence as deep as any in the West. A silence that suggests even the most enduring civilizations were not immune to the temptation to reshape time itself. The Islamic Golden Age is remembered as a time of dazzling brilliance. From the 8th to the 13th century, the cities of Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba became beacons of light in a world that elsewhere seemed dimmed. Scholars preserved Greek texts, invented new sciences, mapped the stars, and advanced medicine and philosophy. It is said that while Europe slumbered in its dark ages, the Islamic world carried the torch of civilization. But what if this story is not as clear as it seems? What if the brilliance we celebrate rose out of a silence that still haunts the timeline? Silence that may suggest invention as much as preservation. At the heart of this golden era stands the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, a fabled library and academy where scholars translated and expanded upon the works of Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy. It is from here that algebra was born, that advances in optics and astronomy flourished, that medicine leapt forward. Yet the records of this great institution are strangely sparse. The building itself no longer stands. Accounts of it come largely from later sources. Was it truly the vast centre of knowledge we imagine, or has its legend grown to fill the void left by missing years? The brilliance of the Golden Age also sits uncomfortably within the wider puzzle of phantom centuries. It begins almost immediately after the supposed silence of Europe's dark ages, as though the torch of progress had been passed seamlessly from one civilization to another. But was this continuity real, or was it constructed? If centuries were added to Europe's calendar, then the Islamic Golden Age may not have followed the Dark Ages at all. It may have overlapped with times and places in ways we no longer recognize. Astronomical records again deepen the mystery. Muslim astronomers carefully charted the movements of stars and planets, leaving observations that should perfectly align with the heavens. And yet, as with Chinese chronicles, inconsistencies appear. Some eclipses and conjunctions do not fit the dates given. Could this be evidence that their observations were later misdated, shifted to fit a timeline already warped by earlier adjustments? And then there is the question of preservation. Much of what we credit to the Golden Age are translations, Greek, Roman, Indian, Persian knowledge carried forward. But were these translations truly products of the 8th and 9th centuries? Or were they later creations, copied and backdated to fill in the gaps? Could the brilliance of the Golden Age itself be partly an illusion, built from fragments of knowledge that survived elsewhere, then retroactively ascribed to this era of supposed flourishing? This is not to deny the achievements of Islamic scholars, many of which are undeniable. Their contributions to mathematics, architecture, and philosophy are written into the very foundation of our world. But the question lingers. Did this brilliance erupt exactly as the timeline tells us, or has it been placed there to mask silences, to smooth over centuries where history falters? Even the legends surrounding figures like Al-Khwarizmi, Avicenna, and Alhazen carry a dreamlike quality. Their works are vast, their influence immense, and yet their lives are often wrapped in stories that sound more symbolic than biographical. Were they singular geniuses, or were their names vessels attached to bodies of knowledge collected and rewritten long after? If the Islamic Golden Age was partly constructed, if its timeline was stretched or embellished, it raises a deeper question. Why? Perhaps to give the impression of continuity in a world fractured by phantom time, perhaps to claim ownership of knowledge that might otherwise have been lost, or perhaps because history itself demands bright ages to balance its dark ones, even if those bright ages must be painted after the fact. The Golden Age still shines in our imagination, but when we look closer we see its edges blur. Its brilliance may conceal silences, its continuity may mask fractures, its story may be as much invention as memory. And if that is true, then the Islamic Golden Age, like so much of history, may be less a reflection of the past than a mirror held up to the present, showing us what we wanted to believe rather than what truly was. Long before Columbus crossed the ocean, the Americas were alive with civilizations whose brilliance rivaled any in the Old World. Vast cities rose from jungles and deserts, networks of trade stretched across mountains and rivers, and monuments of stone still stand as witnesses to their power. And yet, when we open the pages of history, so much of their story is missing. The narrative we were taught begins with Europeans, as though the centuries before were only prelude, as though the civilizations of the Americas had already vanished into silence. But they had not vanished, they were erased. Consider the Maya. For centuries they charted the heavens with uncanny precision, building temples that aligned with stars and planets, carving calendars that stretched into millennia. Their cities, Tikal, Palenque, Chichen Itza, were marvels of architecture and culture. Yet by the time Europeans arrived, many of these cities had already fallen into ruin. What caused their collapse remains a mystery. Drought, war, rebellion. Each theory explains part of the story, but not the whole. The deeper puzzle is this: how could a civilization so advanced, so widespread, simply disappear from memory until their ruins were swallowed by jungle? The Aztec Empire, too, is remembered through a haze. We know of Tenochtitlan, the city of canals and causeways, but much of what we know comes from the pens of Spanish conquerors, men who had every reason to shape the story to justify their conquest. What knowledge, what chronicles, what histories of the Aztecs were destroyed in flames? How many centuries of memory turned to ash the moment the libraries of Mesoamerica were burned? And then there are the Inca, builders of roads and cities that defy explanation. Machu Picchu rests among the peaks like a crown, its stones fitted so perfectly that not even a blade of grass can slip between them. The Inca ruled an empire that stretched thousands of miles, connected not by the wheel or the horse, but by feet and fibre, by roads so enduring they are still walked today. Yet they left behind no written language we can fully understand. Their stories survive in fragments woven into the quipu, knotted cords whose meanings have been lost to us. Was this truly a limitation of their culture, or have the codes simply not yet been broken? What knowledge do those knots still carry, waiting to be read? But the forgotten Americas are not just the great empires. Across the continent, countless civilizations thrived and then vanished. Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, was once home to tens of thousands, a city of mounds and plazas larger than London at the time. Yet by the time Europeans came, its people had gone, their story erased, their city remembered only in whispers. The same silence stretches across the deserts of the southwest, where the ancestral Puebloans built cliff dwellings and great houses, then walked away, leaving behind only the hollow echo of abandoned stone. The tragedy of the Americas is not just collapse, it is erasure. When the Spanish burned Maya codices, when Inca treasures were melted down, when native voices were silenced, entire centuries were cut away. The missing years of the Americas are not gaps of chance, but wounds inflicted by conquest. History was rewritten, the narrative bent to center the conquerors, leaving only fragments of the civilizations that had once flourished. Yet even in fragments, the truth refuses to vanish. The ruins still stand, the myths still linger, the stones still speak. They whisper that the Americas were not empty lands awaiting discovery, but continents alive with brilliance, order, and memory. They remind us that the story told in our history books is not complete, that before Columbus, before conquest, there was a forgotten age, deliberately erased yet still waiting beneath the soil, beneath the forests, beneath the silence. And so we are left with the haunting possibility. If entire civilizations could be cut from memory in the span of a single conquest, how many more centuries remain hidden, buried beneath layers of erasure? The Americas are a testament to what happens when history is not lost by accident but deliberately silenced. And in that silence we glimpse the truth. The forgotten age is not just Europe's puzzle but the world's. The Mayan world was once alive with light. Cities rose like stone forests, their pyramids piercing the canopy, their plazas filled with the rhythm of ceremony and trade. The Maya tracked the heavens with a precision that still astounds astronomers today, carving calendars that measured not only years but cosmic cycles stretching thousands of years into the future. Their art, their writing, their monuments, they all spoke of a people who understood the deep rhythm of time. And then, as if swallowed by the jungle itself, their great cities were abandoned. The Maya collapsed. We call it a collapse, but the truth is stranger. The Maya did not vanish overnight. Their cities declined in waves, each center falling silent while others carried on. Some, like Tikal and Copan, were abandoned suddenly, their temples left unfinished, their altars toppled. Others lingered longer, fading into ruin over centuries. Yet in every case the end came without a single cause, without a neat explanation. Historians offer drought, warfare, overpopulation, disease. Each theory explains part of the story, but none explain it all. The collapse remains one of history's most enduring riddles. The silence of the Maya is haunting not just for what we lost, but for what remains hidden. Their cities were swallowed by the jungle, their books destroyed by conquest. Only 4 codices survived the flames of Spanish priests who believed their knowledge to be heresy. 4 fragile books to carry the weight of a civilization that spanned centuries. What secrets were erased when the rest were burned? What histories were lost when the jungle reclaimed the stone? Archaeologists tell us that beneath the canopy, thousands of undiscovered structures still wait. Using LiDAR, a scanning technology that can see through the trees, they have revealed sprawling networks of cities, roads, temples, and fortifications stretching far beyond what we once believed. These discoveries suggest the Maya were not only advanced, but far more numerous than history books admit. Millions may have lived in these jungle cities, and yet their story was cut short, their age erased, their memory silenced. Some whisper that the Maya knew something we do not, that their calendars, often misinterpreted as prophecies of the end of the world, were not predictions of apocalypse, but warnings about cycles of time, ages that rise and fall, civilizations that flourish and collapse, truths that are buried and then reborn. Could the collapse of their cities have been part of such a cycle? Did they abandon their temples not because of failure, but because of knowledge we no longer understand? The collapse of the Maya is not just a question of archaeology, it is a wound in history, a reminder that civilizations can vanish not only from the earth but from our memory, that whole centuries can be swallowed in silence, leaving only fragments of stone and whispers in legend. Yet the Maya did not vanish entirely. Their descendants still live in the Yucatan, Guatemala and Honduras. Their languages are still spoken, their traditions still practiced. They carry the legacy of a people who once mapped the stars, built cities that defied the jungle, and measured time itself with uncanny precision. The collapse was not the end, it was an erasure. When we stand before the ruins of their temples, overtaken by roots and vines, we feel the weight of what has been lost. The Mayan collapse is not only a mystery of how a civilization fell, it is a mystery of how memory itself can be cut away, leaving behind only questions carved into stone. And in that silence the jungle still whispers, not of what ended, but of what remains hidden. Egypt's dynasties were meant to be a ladder of time, each pharaoh stepping onto the throne, ruling, then giving way to the next, their names carved in stone for eternity. In theory, the timeline of the pharaohs should be one of the clearest in all of history. In practice, it is anything but. The story of Egypt is tangled, contradictory, and riddled with silences. Dynasties overlap, reigns contradict each other, and entire centuries stretch longer or shorter than they should. It is as if some of Egypt's kings were never real, or worse, as if some were remembered twice. These are the phantom pharaohs, rulers whose very existence is called into question. The first cracks appear when we study the king lists, inscribed by priests on temple walls or written on fragile papyrus. The Abydos king list, for example, offers a sequence of rulers meant to legitimize the pharaoh Seti I, yet it skips over others, erasing names that were inconvenient. The Turin papyrus, another attempt at chronology, is badly damaged but hints at reigns so long they border on the impossible, centuries for a single king. Were these exaggerations, or were they echoes of an older time pushed into the dynasties to pad the calendar? Even the famous historian Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BC, presents dynasties that often do not align with archaeological evidence. Some pharaohs appear to have reigned in 2 places at once, others are doubled. Their names suspiciously similar to rulers who supposedly lived centuries earlier. Could this be a case of scribes duplicating kings to fill gaps? Or does it point to something deeper, an intentional reshaping of time to stretch Egypt's history across thousands of years? The monuments themselves deepen the puzzle. Temples and pyramids often show architectural styles that seem out of place, either too advanced for their supposed era or oddly primitive compared to what came before. Some scholars suggest that later pharaohs may have claimed the works of earlier ones, chiseling away old names and carving their own in place. If true, then much of what we attribute to specific rulers may belong to entirely different centuries. The timeline becomes less a sequence and more a collage, rulers stitched onto monuments that were never theirs. This is not just speculation. We know for certain that Egyptian rulers practiced usurpation, taking credit for works that were not their own. Ramses II, one of the most celebrated pharaohs, was notorious for carving his name onto statues built by earlier kings. If such rewriting was common, how much of Egypt's timeline is an illusion? How many pharaohs were ghosts conjured to fill gaps left by silence or to glorify dynasties that needed legitimacy? The phantom pharaohs haunt us because they remind us how fragile even stone records can be. Names can be erased, monuments can be reassigned, dynasties can be stretched, overlapped, or duplicated until the truth is no longer visible. What we are left with is a puzzle where the pieces do not fit but are forced together anyway, creating a picture that looks convincing until you look too closely. If centuries were truly invented in the Middle Ages, then Egypt's phantom pharaohs may have been the template, a timeline already stretched, already rewritten, already manipulated to fit the needs of power. When we stand before the statues of these kings, staring into their timeless eyes, we cannot help but wonder, are we seeing the face of a real ruler, or the mask of a ghost placed upon history to make it seem longer, grander, more eternal than it truly was? Egypt whispers through its ruins, but it whispers in riddles. The dynasties we read in books may not be the ones that ever ruled. The pharaohs we know by name may be shadows of shadows, and somewhere, beneath the silences and duplications, the true story of Egypt waits, hidden, still untold. The Sumerians are remembered as the first great civilization, the people who gave us writing, laws, and the foundations of city life. They rose from the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates, and carved their names into clay tablets that still whisper across 5,000 years. We call them the beginning of history itself, because with them came cuneiform, the first written record. And yet, even here at the dawn of civilization, the timeline begins to blur. There are gaps, there are reigns that stretch impossibly long, there are silences that hint at a past older than we dare admit. The Sumerian king list is one of the most haunting documents ever uncovered. On its clay tablets it records a line of rulers stretching back into the mists of time. Some ruled for decades, others for centuries, and some for thousands of years. Entire dynasties supposedly lasted longer than all of recorded history. Mainstream historians dismiss these numbers as myth, exaggeration, the blending of gods and men. But what if they are echoes of a forgotten truth? What if these impossible reigns are not fantasy, but memory, fragmented and distorted across the ages? The king list also reveals strange duplications. Cities rise and fall in repeating cycles, rulers with similar names appear centuries apart, and dynasties overlap in ways that make little sense. Scholars attempt to arrange them into a neat sequence, yet contradictions remain. Was this simply the confusion of early record keepers, or was time itself stretched? Were entire centuries inserted to make the story seem longer, more continuous, more impressive? And then there is the silence between the lines. Archaeology reveals gaps in settlement, periods where cities seem to vanish, only to reappear centuries later as though nothing had changed. Pottery styles freeze in place. Technology halts, and then suddenly surges forward again. Were these natural cycles of rise and fall, or were missing centuries later patched into the record, smoothing over a history more fractured than we admit? The myths of the Sumerians deepen the mystery. They tell of the Anunnaki, gods who descended from the heavens to teach humanity. They speak of a flood that wiped away entire ages, of kings who reigned before and after, of knowledge handed down from a time before history began. Could these myths be memories of civilizations lost in the gaps, their traces erased, their centuries folded out of the official timeline? Even the invention of writing itself carries questions. Cuneiform appears suddenly fully developed, as though it had been given rather than invented. Within a short span, the Sumerians were recording laws, trade, and astronomy with a sophistication that should have taken centuries to evolve. Where did this leap come from? Were the Sumerians truly the beginning, or were they inheritors of a much older knowledge carried forward from a civilization erased by silence? The Sumerian gaps remind us that even at history's supposed dawn, the story is not whole. The king list's impossible reigns may be myth, or they may be the faint memory of ages we no longer recognize. The silences in the archaeological record may be natural, or they may be the shadows of centuries erased. And the myths of gods and floods may be fantasy, or they may be history's most fragile survivors, telling us in symbols what could not be preserved in stone. To walk among the ruins of Ur or Uruk is to feel the presence of a story far older than the textbooks allow. The ziggurats rise from the desert like broken stairways to the heavens, but they lead not only upward, they lead backward into the forgotten years. The gaps of Sumer are not just cracks in the timeline, they are doors. And behind them may lie a past older than history itself. Babylon, the city of hanging gardens and towering ziggurats, is often seen as the rightful heir to Sumer. Where the Sumerians invented writing, the Babylonians refined it, producing astronomical records, legal codes, and myths that still shape our imagination today. Yet when we look closely at Babylon's story, something is not right. The timeline of its kings does not flow as smoothly as the textbooks suggest. Reigns overlap, dynasties double back upon themselves, centuries expand and contract as though someone were stretching history like clay. These are the signs of what some call the Babylonian Edit, years and rulers that may have been shifted, erased, or even invented to create a story that never truly happened. The Babylonian king lists written on clay tablets attempt to give order to centuries of rule, but order is not what we find. Some kings appear in one list but vanish in another. Others reign for suspiciously long spans, their numbers echoing the exaggerations of the earlier Sumerian king list. Still others seem to be remembered twice, their names altered only slightly, as if copied and reused to pad the record. When scholars try to align these lists with archaeological evidence, gaps appear. Whole decades cannot be accounted for. The fabric of time begins to fray. Even the most famous of Babylon's rulers, Hammurabi, is not immune to the puzzle. We are told he ruled in the 18th century BC, leaving behind the famous Code of Hammurabi, one of the world's oldest sets of written laws. Yet when archaeologists attempt to match his reign with astronomical records, questions emerge. The stars described in Babylonian tablets do not always match the skies of the proposed dates. Could it be that Hammurabi, like Charlemagne centuries later, has been misplaced on the calendar? Was his reign shifted forward or backward to fill a silence in time? The problem deepens when we examine the Babylonian chronicles, accounts of wars, famines, and omens. They often read less like eyewitness records and more like retroactive reconstructions, written long after the events they describe. Were these chronicles genuine memory, or were they rewritten scripts, carefully crafted to give the illusion of continuity? If so, then Babylon's story may not be a window into history, but a stage upon which time itself was rehearsed and performed. Astronomy again becomes the silent witness. The Babylonians were master observers of the heavens, recording eclipses, planetary motions, and star patterns. These records should anchor their timeline securely, and yet discrepancies remain. Some eclipses appear centuries out of place. Planetary alignments do not always match their assigned dates. Scholars argue endlessly about which events correspond to which reigns, rearranging time itself in an attempt to make the heavens fit the history. But perhaps the problem is not with the stars. Perhaps it is with the timeline we have been given. Why would Babylonian history be edited? The answer may lie in power. Just as Egyptian pharaohs carved their names over those of earlier kings, Babylonian rulers may have reshaped the past to legitimize their rule. By rewriting history, they claimed not only the present but eternity itself. Later empires from Persia to Greece to Rome may have inherited these edited records, carrying forward a version of time already distorted. By the time medieval scribes copied these stories, the edits had become indistinguishable from truth. The Babylonian edit is not only about Babylon, it is about the fragility of all ancient timelines. When clay tablets can contradict the stars, when kings can appear twice under different names, when centuries can expand or contract to suit the needs of rulers, then history itself becomes malleable. What we think of as the bedrock of civilization may, in fact, be shifting sand. To walk among the ruins of Babylon today is to feel the weight of this uncertainty. The bricks may still whisper the names of kings, but which kings truly lived and which were conjured from silence we may never know. The towers and gardens are gone, but the questions remain. How many of Babylon's years were real, and how many were edits written into clay not by time but by power? Rome was once the heartbeat of the known world. Its legions marched across continents, its aqueducts carried water to cities of stone, and its laws shaped the lives of millions. From Britain to Mesopotamia, the empire left its imprint in roads, monuments, and ruins that still endure. And yet, in the official timeline of Rome, there are stretches that feel strangely empty. Centuries where the power of Rome is said to continue, but the evidence of its heartbeat grows faint. These are Rome's silent centuries, the years when its legions seem to vanish, its greatness fades into whispers, and its memory fractures into shadows. The story we are told is simple. Rome fell in the 5th century, its empire collapsing under the weight of barbarians, corruption, and decay. But before that final fall, it endured centuries of slow decline, a gradual fading of glory, a long, drawn-out silence. Yet when we search for the proof of this decline, the trail grows thin. Battles described in chronicles leave little trace, Emperors appear and disappear on lists, some reigning only months, others remembered only by name. Whole decades seem to pass with no great monuments, no flourishing of art, no signs of the life one would expect from such a vast empire. Consider the so-called crisis of the 3rd century, when emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed. According to historians, Rome nearly collapsed under civil wars, invasions, and economic turmoil. Yet archaeology tells a different story. In many cities, life seems to continue much as before. Buildings rise, coins circulate, trade flows. Where are the scars of a crisis so severe it nearly ended the empire? Were these events exaggerated, invented, or do they belong to another time altogether? Then there is the curious gap in Rome's architecture. After the great works of the early empire, the Colosseum, the aqueducts, the forums, there is a lull. Centuries where the empire supposedly still thrived, yet produced little to rival its earlier monuments. When grand buildings reappear, their style often seems out of place, as though centuries of architectural evolution are missing. Was Rome truly building nothing, or have those centuries been stretched, filled with phantom years that never existed? Even the legions themselves become ghosts. Rome's armies were its soul. Yet in the later centuries, records of their movements grow thin. Battles are described in texts but leave little archaeological footprint. Entire legions vanish from history without explanation. Were they destroyed, or did they simply never exist in the first place, invented by chroniclers to populate centuries that otherwise lay empty? The silence grows louder when we remember the phantom time hypothesis. The missing centuries in Europe, the years from 614 to 911, would have overlapped with Rome's supposed decline and transformation into the medieval world. If those centuries were never lived, then Rome's silent years may be nothing more than illusions. The crisis, the endless parade of emperors, the gradual fading into darkness, all of it could be a manufactured bridge invented to stretch time between the empire's fall and the world that came after. Why would such a silence be constructed? Perhaps to give legitimacy to rulers who needed Rome's legacy to anchor their own. By extending the timeline, they could claim continuity, drawing strength from an empire that had already crumbled. By fabricating emperors and crises, they could fill the gaps with stories that explained the transition from ancient to medieval, smoothing over the fractures of time. To walk through the ruins of Rome today is to feel both the grandeur and the absence. The stones tell us of greatness, of power, of an empire that reshaped the world, but they also remind us of the silence, the centuries where the story does not fit, where the pieces do not align, where time itself seems to falter. Rome's legions may have conquered the world, but even they could not conquer silence. And so we are left to wonder, did Rome truly endure for centuries after its peak? Or are those years shadows, stretched across the calendar by hands we can no longer see? In the silent centuries of Rome, we glimpse not just the fragility of an empire, but the fragility of history itself. Beneath the streets of Vatican City lies one of the most secretive collections of documents on earth, the Vatican Apostolic Archives, once known simply as the Secret Archives. Behind locked doors and guarded corridors, thousands upon thousands of manuscripts rest in silence, some older than entire nations, some said to contain knowledge that could rewrite everything we think we know about the past. To most of the world, these archives are little more than a rumour, a name that stirs curiosity. To those who have studied history's fractures and vanishing years, they represent something else, the place where forbidden timelines may still be kept, hidden from the light. The archives are said to stretch for more than 50 miles of shelving, lined with ancient scrolls, papal decrees, letters, chronicles, and texts carried forward from civilizations long gone. Among them, whispers say, are maps of lands that should not have existed, records of dynasties erased from memory, and accounts of years we are told never happened. If centuries have been fabricated, as the phantom time theory suggests, then the Vatican is perhaps the one place where the original records still remain, proof that history was bent, reshaped, or deleted. Access is strictly controlled, Only a handful of scholars are ever permitted inside, and even they are restricted to small sections, carefully monitored in what they are allowed to view. Why such secrecy? Why, in an age where so much information is digitized and made public, does the Vatican still keep so much of history under lock and key? The official answer is preservation, the need to protect fragile documents. But the silence leaves room for darker possibilities. Perhaps some knowledge is not preserved simply for safety, but suppressed, kept hidden because its revelation would shatter the narrative of history as we know it. Over the years, rumours of the archives have only grown. Some claim they hold correspondence between Roman emperors and early Christian leaders that would change the story of the Church's origins. Others whisper of documents proving the existence of civilizations long forgotten, Tartaria, Atlantis, or empires erased from time. Still others believe the archives contain astronomical records that prove the timeline itself has been altered, with missing or invented centuries hidden away in the vaults. The Vatican's role in shaping history cannot be ignored. For centuries, the Church was the keeper of knowledge, the authority that decided which texts were sacred and which were heretical. It preserved some works, destroyed others, and rewrote many to fit its vision of truth. If anyone had the means to edit time, to erase inconvenient centuries or invent new ones, it was the Church. And the archives may still carry the traces of that edit, records that did not survive anywhere else, waiting in silence. But perhaps the most chilling possibility is not what the archives contain, but what they have already removed. Fires and purges throughout history had destroyed countless texts. How much of what once lay in the vaults has already been erased forever, ensuring that certain truths never reach the outside world? The silence is not only in what is hidden, it is in what has been taken away. To imagine walking the corridors of the Vatican archives is to imagine standing face to face with the ghost of time itself. Behind each locked door could be a century we no longer remember. Behind each sealed manuscript could be the truth about history's fractures. And yet, those doors remain closed. The silence endures. The Vatican tells us that the archives are simply a library, a collection of records with nothing to hide. But as long as they remain sealed from the world, the suspicion lingers. That in those miles of shelves lies the proof of what we have always feared, that history has not just been forgotten, but deliberately rewritten. And so, the Vatican archives remain one of history's greatest mysteries, a vault of silence beneath the heart of power, a reminder that the story of humanity may still be waiting in the dark, hidden not by time, but by design. Power leaves fingerprints not only on monuments and crowns, but on time itself. When we ask who benefits from erased centuries, from phantom rulers, from silences stitched into history, the answer is almost always the same: those who already hold power and those who seek to keep it. Time is not a neutral river, it is a weapon, and those who wield it can stretch or shrink it as they please, bending reality to match their rule. Imagine a king faced with fragile legitimacy. His bloodline is disputed, his right to the throne weak. By adding a dynasty before his own, by inventing centuries of continuity, he becomes not the usurper but the heir to an unbroken line. His crown gleams with the weight of false antiquity. His authority grows not from his deeds, but from centuries conjured out of silence. The past becomes his shield. Or imagine a church seeking to bind itself to prophecy. The stars, the scriptures, the calendar itself must align to mark its reign as destined. By adjusting the dates, by erasing inconvenient years or inserting new ones, the present is placed at the perfect point in history's arc. The church is no longer one voice among many. It becomes the chosen voice, its authority confirmed by the timeline it secretly controls. Even emperors understood this. To rule Rome was to inherit its eternity. But what if that eternity was shorter than it appeared? By expanding centuries, by filling gaps with phantom rulers, the empire could stretch its shadow further into the past, claiming a longevity that legitimized its dominance. The longer an empire appeared to endure, the harder it became to imagine a world without it. Time itself became propaganda, This is the dead hand of power. It reaches back into history and rearranges the story so that its grip on the present seems unbreakable. It silences dissent by erasing it. It eliminates rivals by writing them out of memory. It glorifies rulers by surrounding them with centuries of invention. And the most chilling part, once rewritten, the past becomes reality. Generations grow up believing it, teaching it, building their lives upon it. What began as invention hardens into truth. The benefits of erased years are not just political. They are economic, cultural, even psychological. A people taught that their nation has endured for 1,000 years will accept hardship in the name of that continuity. A church that claims to fulfill ancient prophecy will hold believers more tightly in its grasp. An empire that rewrites its origins ensures that rebellion feels not only futile but unnatural, a crime against the very fabric of time. And once centuries have been erased, who is left to prove otherwise? The scribes who might remember are silenced. The documents that might expose the lie are burned. The monuments that contradict the story are defaced or reassigned. All that remains is the version of time approved by those in power, a silence that benefits the rulers while the truth lies buried beneath the weight of official memory. It is tempting to believe that history is simply a record of what happened. But when we see the vanishing years, the phantom rulers, the suspiciously neat chronologies, we must face a darker possibility. History is not always what happened. History is what was allowed to survive. And the hands that allowed it were never neutral. They were hands grasping for power, tightening their hold by tightening their control over the very flow of time. The dead hand of power still lingers. Its grip extends into the present, shaping not just what we believe about the past, but how we imagine our future. And until we confront the possibility that time itself has been manipulated, we remain bound by its silence, living in a story written not for us, but for those who needed us to believe it. In the candlelit scriptoria of medieval Europe, monks bent over parchment, quills scratching as ink spread across vellum. They were not merely copying the past, they were creating it. With every flourish of the pen, history was preserved, but it was also reshaped, sometimes subtly, sometimes entirely. The medieval world trusted its scribes to be guardians of memory, but many of them were also forgers, inventors, and architects of a past that never truly was. In their hands, centuries could be stretched, rulers could be conjured, and events could be brought to life that had never happened at all. The motives were often practical. A monastery needed to prove its land rights, so a charter was forged. A king needed to legitimize his reign, so a genealogy was invented, linking him to a glorious ancestor who might never have lived. A church sought authority, so documents were discovered proving its ancient dominion. These forgeries, often accepted as genuine at the time, became part of the official record. Once copied, cited, and recopied, they blurred into the fabric of history until the truth was no longer distinguishable from the lie. One of the most famous examples is the donation of Constantine, a document supposedly written by Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, granting immense power and territory to the Pope. For centuries, it was used to justify papal authority over kings and emperors alike. Yet it was a forgery, created in the Middle Ages. Its language betrayed it, its details exposed it, but by then it had already reshaped centuries of power dynamics. The Pope's authority grew not from truth, but from a forged piece of parchment. And this was not an isolated case. Forgery was endemic to the medieval world. Chronicles were altered, dates adjusted, saints' lives expanded with miracles never witnessed, relics created to inspire devotion and control. Every cathedral claimed a sacred bone, a fragment of the true cross, a vial of holy blood. Pilgrims came, wealth flowed, and belief deepened, all built upon inventions carefully crafted to appear ancient. The problem is not only that these forgeries existed, it is that they became the foundation of the timeline itself. If a forged charter places a king's reign in a certain year and later chronicles build upon that date, then the entire chronology is anchored to a fiction. Remove the fiction and the timeline collapses. Could this explain the phantom centuries? Could they be the cumulative result of forgeries, errors, and inventions layered over centuries until they filled gaps that never should have been there? The monks may not have thought of themselves as deceivers. To them, truth was not always literal. To forge a past that justified present power was to serve God, the king, or the greater order. A scribe who invented a genealogy was not lying, but revealing a higher truth about divine right. A chronicler who described battles never fought was not fabricating, but ensuring that the past matched the needs of the present. In their hands, history was clay, moulded to serve faith and authority. But faith does not erase the consequences. These forgeries ripple through time, distorting our view of the past even today. Modern historians uncover them, yes, but how many still lie hidden, their ink blurred by centuries, their inventions now indistinguishable from genuine memory? If whole centuries were invented, it may not have been through one grand conspiracy, but through countless small acts of invention, each adding a layer of fiction until the timeline itself became a forgery. To picture a medieval scribe in his cell is to see the fragile heart of history. A single hand, a single quill, a single decision to invent rather than record, and centuries are reshaped. The silence of the Dark Ages may not be silence at all, but a chorus of invented voices written into being by those who believed they were writing truth. And so we are left with an uneasy thought. If the past was forged, then what we call history is not memory, but belief. A story written by candlelight, whispered by quills, and sealed in ink that never told the whole truth. Across Europe and beyond, stone towers, cathedrals, and fortresses rise from the earth as though they were always meant to be there. We look at them and see continuity, centuries of construction, each building a step forward from the last. Yet when we study them more closely, a strange problem emerges. Some buildings seem far too advanced for their supposed era, displaying techniques and artistry that should not have existed yet. Others appear centuries too simple, as though they belonged to a much earlier age. The result is a puzzle historians rarely confront directly, the architecture problem. Monuments that do not fit the timeline. Take the great cathedrals of Europe. According to the textbooks, Gothic architecture burst forth in the 12th century, with soaring spires, flying buttresses, and stained glass windows that turned stone into light. Yet when we look closer, this style appears almost fully formed, with no clear path of evolution. Where are the centuries of experimentation that should have led to such brilliance? One day, Europe was supposedly in the shadows of the Dark Ages. The next, cathedrals rose like frozen lightning across the continent. Was this really progress? Or was the timeline itself adjusted to make a sudden leap appear natural? Other structures raise similar questions. Castles attributed to the early medieval period often use advanced masonry techniques that suggest a knowledge of geometry and physics more in line with the Renaissance than with centuries of supposed collapse. Stone vaults, arches, and fortifications appear with such sophistication that they seem out of place in the silent centuries that preceded them. Did medieval builders rediscover ancient knowledge, or were these structures originally from an older age, reassigned to later centuries by chroniclers trying to fill the gaps? The puzzle extends far beyond Europe. In South America, the stonework of sites like Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo defies explanation. Massive blocks, some weighing hundreds of tons, were fitted together with such precision that not even a blade of grass can slide between them. Official history places these structures within the Inca era, yet even the Inca themselves spoke of them as the work of an earlier people. If so, then the architecture does not just challenge the timeline, it undermines it entirely, suggesting civilizations far older than we admit. In Egypt too, the problem persists. Temples and monuments show styles that shift dramatically, as though separated by centuries, yet are often attributed to rulers within the same narrow span of time. The Great Pyramid stands at the dawn of Egyptian history, with precision that later dynasties never matched. How could the Egyptians begin with such brilliance, then decline into cruder forms? Unless, of course, the timeline has been stretched, the monuments reassigned, the truth of their origins hidden within phantom centuries. Some argue that the architecture problem is simply our ignorance. That lost knowledge explains the leaps, that workers rediscovered techniques when needed. But this explanation grows thin when we see the same problem repeated across the world, across cultures, across centuries. Buildings that appear out of nowhere, others that seem misplaced, and styles that evolve not gradually but in sudden, inexplicable bursts. Perhaps architecture is the most honest witness of all. Stones do not lie as easily as parchment. A forged document can invent a king, but a cathedral must stand in the world defying gravity. When the stones contradict the story, perhaps it is not the stones that are wrong, but the story. The architecture problem haunts us because it is visible. Anyone can look at these buildings and feel the strangeness, a sense that they belong not where they are placed, but somewhere else in time. They are monuments not only of stone, but of silence, the silence of years that may have been invented, erased, or reassigned to make history seem whole. And so the question lingers in every arch and spire: do these buildings truly belong to the centuries assigned to them? Or are they the survivors of a forgotten age, standing in plain sight, still whispering of a timeline that has been rewritten? When history falters, the sky remains. Stars do not lie, and planets do not forget their paths. The heavens move with a rhythm older than humanity, a clock so precise that even the smallest drift becomes measurable across millennia. This is why astronomers often say that the sky is the ultimate witness of time. And yet, when we compare the records of ancient observers with the calculations of modern science, something unsettling emerges. The sky, in many cases, does not match the history we are told. Ancient civilizations were meticulous watchers of the heavens. The Babylonians recorded eclipses with obsessive care, charting lunar and solar events in clay tablets. The Chinese logged comets, novae, and planetary conjunctions across centuries. The Mayans aligned their temples with solstices and equinoxes, embedding cosmic order into their architecture. These records should give us an unbroken chain of evidence, pinning history firmly in place. But when we check them, inconsistencies appear. Eclipses described in certain reigns do not align with what the heavens would have shown at the time. Planetary positions are shifted by decades, even centuries. Scholars explain these anomalies as errors of transmission. A scribe copying a text centuries later may have misdated an event. A chronicler may have misunderstood the difference between a solar halo and an eclipse. But what if the problem is deeper? What if the records were not mistaken but misaligned because the timeline itself has been stretched? If phantom centuries exist, then astronomy becomes the crack in the wall, the silent proof that our calendar does not match reality. Consider the famous eclipse of Thales, said to have occurred during a battle in 585 BC. The event is often cited as one of the earliest historically dated eclipses, but some astronomers argue that the descriptions do not perfectly match the eclipse that year. Other candidates exist in different centuries. Which one is real? If our timeline were shifted by even a few hundred years, the event would make more sense. The uncertainty is not in the sky, it is in our history. In China too, the discrepancies are troubling. Records of eclipses under certain dynasties do not fit the calculations. Some appear centuries too early, others too late. Were the scribes simply mistaken, or were they recording real events that we have placed in the wrong time? If the dynasties themselves were shifted, if centuries were added or deleted, then the astronomical record becomes a witness to the fraud. The Mayans built entire calendars around the heavens, predicting eclipses, solstices, and the slow dance of Venus. Their accuracy was extraordinary. Yet when scholars attempt to match their records to our calendar, adjustments are constantly required. Cycles fit, but the dates slip. Did the Maya miscalculate, or have we, Is their calendar wrong, or is ours built upon centuries that never were? Even in the Middle Ages, astronomy poses questions. Monks and scholars recorded eclipses, comets, and planetary alignments, often with great care. Yet when modern scientists test these against computer models of celestial mechanics, some do not line up. A comet said to appear in 1 year may have in fact appeared decades earlier. A lunar eclipse described during one reign may not have been visible at all. Once again, the heavens disagree with history. The sky does not shift, its rhythm is eternal. If our history does not fit the stars, then perhaps it is not the stars that are wrong, but the story we have written. Perhaps the missing years, the phantom centuries, and the silences in our chronicles are revealed most clearly in the heavens above. When we look into the night sky, we are looking not only at light from distant stars, but at memory itself, pure, unbroken, unedited. If that memory does not align with the histories we tell, then the truth is clear. Someone, somewhere, has rewritten time. For as long as humanity has lifted its gaze to the heavens, the stars have served as markers of time. They're not only lights in the night sky, but a cosmic calendar, shifting predictably through the ages in a slow and steady drift known as precession. Monuments across the world, from Stonehenge to the pyramids, from Mayan temples to Indian observatories, were built in alignment with the stars. These alignments should anchor us, allowing us to pin down dates with certainty. Yet when we compare the positions of these stars to the history we are told, something unsettling emerges. The alignments suggest lost centuries, periods that should exist, but do not. Precession moves the stars by a tiny fraction each year. Over centuries, this movement becomes undeniable. If a temple was built to align with the rising of Sirius, or with the constellation Orion, then its orientation tells us the approximate date of its construction. Yet, again and again, the monuments do not match the timeline. The pyramids of Giza, for example, are said to date to around 2500 BC, but their alignment with Orion's belt fits far better with a date thousands of years earlier. Did the Egyptians truly possess such advanced astronomy at that time, or have we misplaced entire epochs? The same mystery appears at other sites. In India, temples supposedly built in the medieval period show star alignments that suggest construction centuries earlier. In the Americas, Mayan observatories align perfectly with celestial events, but the dates given in our timeline often require adjustment to fit. Each time, scholars explain the discrepancies as coincidence, or claim the builders were imprecise. But what if the builders were precise, and it is our history that is imprecise? What if the stars are telling us that centuries have been lost, hidden, or erased? Even written records deepen the problem. Ancient astronomers described constellations rising at specific times of year. Chinese, Babylonian, and Greek texts give details of equinoxes and solstices, comets and eclipses, all tied to the heavens. When tested against modern calculations, some match perfectly, but others do not. A star said to rise in the east during one dynasty appears only centuries earlier or later. An equinox described by a chronicler aligns with the heavens, but not with the year it was supposedly observed. Each mismatch whispers of a timeline shifted, of centuries that no longer exist. The missing stars haunt the medieval record as well. European chronicles describe eclipses, conjunctions, and even the appearance of Halley's comet. Yet not all of these fit the years assigned to them. Some align with dates hundreds of years earlier. Others appear twice, as if copied and placed into phantom centuries to make the silence seem full. Did medieval scribes simply make errors? Or were they filling empty time with borrowed skies, assigning the heavens to years that had never been lived? The stars cannot be forged, their motion is eternal, their rhythm unbroken. If our histories do not align with them, then the fault lies not with the heavens but with us. The alignments reveal something we are not meant to see, that centuries may be missing, that events may be misplaced, that our timeline is not a seamless thread but a fabric patched with invention. When we stand at the foot of an ancient monument and look to the stars, we are seeing what the builders saw. If their vision does not match the story we have been told, then the story must be questioned. The missing stars do not shout their truth. They whisper it, patiently, across millennia. And their whisper tells us this: time has been tampered with, centuries have been cut away or added, and the heavens still remember what we have forgotten. The Black Death. The very words summon images of devastation. Villages emptied, carts piled with the dead, priests whispering last rites in the shadow of a disease that swept across continents. We are told that in the mid-14th century, Europe lost nearly half its population, a catastrophe so vast it reshaped the world, ending feudalism, changing economies, and altering history forever. And yet, when we look closely, cracks begin to appear in this narrative. What if some of the plagues that haunt our past were not what we think? What if in some cases they were exaggerated or even invented to explain centuries of silence? The records of the Black Death are uneven. In some regions, chronicles describe whole cities falling, streets choked with corpses, silence in the fields where no one was left to plough. In others, the same years pass with scarcely a mention of plague. Archaeology, too, presents contradictions. In some cemeteries, mass graves appear, grim testimony to sudden loss. In others, burials continue as though nothing extraordinary occurred. If the Black Death was truly as universal as described, why does its evidence vanish in so many places? Earlier plagues pose even greater puzzles. The so-called Plague of Justinian, which struck the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century, is said to have killed millions, weakening the empire and altering the course of history. And yet, archaeology finds little to confirm such devastation. Cities said to have been emptied continued to function. Populations appear stable. Coinage, trade, and construction carry on with barely a ripple. Was this truly a catastrophe or a later invention created to explain silences in the record? One theory suggests that plagues became convenient placeholders. When centuries contained gaps, when documents were missing, when populations appeared to decline, historians filled the silence with pestilence. A plague could explain anything. A village abandoned, plague. Crops left untended, plague. A century with few records, plague. It became the perfect explanation for missing years, one that required no evidence beyond fear itself. Even the numbers strain belief. We are told that the Black Death killed up to 200 million people in the 14th century. Yet Europe's population rebounded within a few generations, faster than such devastation should have allowed. Was the death toll exaggerated, multiplied in chronicles to amplify the drama? Or were whole centuries shifted, making the recovery seem faster because the timeline itself had been compressed? Some researchers note that descriptions of plague symptoms vary wildly. In one chronicle, the disease causes blackened swellings. In another, it brings fevers, delirium, or bleeding. Were these truly the same illness, or were they a patchwork of diseases and stories woven together into one catastrophic narrative? If so, then the plagues we remember may not be singular events, but composites, histories stitched together to explain silences that should never have existed. This is not to say that disease never struck. Epidemics have always haunted humanity, and their scars are real. But the question is whether every plague we are told about truly happened as described, or whether some were magnified, duplicated, or even invented. If rulers and scribes needed to explain why centuries seemed empty, why populations seemed diminished, a plague was the perfect answer. No one could disprove it. Fear itself filled the gaps. When we read of the plagues, we feel the weight of dread, the terror of a world undone. But behind that dread lies a deeper unease. Are we reading memory or invention? Were the plagues genuine catastrophes or convenient stories that gave shape to phantom centuries? The silence of history has many disguises. Sometimes it wears the face of kings who never ruled. Sometimes it hides in architecture that does not fit its time. And sometimes it walks behind the mask of disease, explaining away centuries that may never have existed. The plague that wasn't is more than a question of medicine. It is a question of memory. a reminder that even death itself can be used to rewrite time. The Crusades are among the most dramatic tales in history. Holy wars fought across continents, banners raised in the name of God, armies marching from Europe to the gates of Jerusalem. We are told they reshaped the medieval world, that they were struggles of faith and blood lasting for centuries. The chronicles describe endless battles, great victories, crushing defeats. And yet, when we look for the evidence, a strange silence emerges. For wars said to have consumed whole generations, the Crusades leave surprisingly little trace. The First Crusade is said to have begun in 1096, a mass movement of knights, peasants, and zealots storming eastward to reclaim the Holy Land. We are told of sieges, rivers of blood, and the establishment of Christian kingdoms in foreign soil. But when archaeologists search for the scars of these wars, they often find less than expected. Some of the supposed strongholds of the Crusaders show little evidence of prolonged battle. In Jerusalem itself, layers of history exist, but tying them clearly to Crusader conquest is harder than the chronicles suggest. Did the wars truly unfold as written, or have the stories been exaggerated, even invented to fill the silence of phantom centuries? The problem only deepens with the later Crusades. By the time of the Fourth Crusade, entire armies supposedly diverted to sack Constantinople. Chroniclers describe fire, pillage, and ruin, yet archaeology in the city shows continuity, not devastation. Life continued. Commerce thrived. The scars of conquest are thinner than expected, as though the sack of Constantinople was less a cataclysm than a tale inflated to justify shifts in power. Were these events real, or were they narrative devices smoothing over centuries of silence with stories of holy war? Even the sheer number of crusades, 8 major ones, along with countless smaller campaigns, raises questions. Were they truly distinct wars, or were later chroniclers duplicating stories, spreading one set of events across multiple centuries? The repetition of themes is striking. Armies march east, they win, they lose, they return. Again and again the pattern repeats, almost as if written to fill a formula rather than record reality. Were the Crusades truly a cycle of endless wars, or a cycle of endless copying, the same story retold in different centuries to keep the illusion of continuity alive? The economic and demographic impact also strains belief. We are told that tens of thousands left Europe for the Crusades, yet Europe's population shows no collapse. Its fields were not left untended, its cities did not fall into ruin. Could the numbers have been inflated, the scale exaggerated, to make the wars seem grander, more world-shaping than they truly were? The Crusades also served the needs of power. They gave the Pope legitimacy, binding Europe under one banner. They gave kings authority, cloaking ambition in the mantle of faith. They gave chroniclers stories of glory and destiny, narratives that justified present struggles. If centuries needed filling, if phantom years required weight, the Crusades were the perfect invention. Holy wars could explain silences, justify gaps, and glorify rulers all at once. To stand in the ruins of supposed Crusader castles today is to feel the unease. Their stones whisper of battles, yes, but not of the endless, continent-shaking wars described in the chronicles. More often, they speak of continuity, of lives lived, of trade and exchange across cultures. Perhaps the Crusades were not the wars we think. Perhaps they were smaller, shorter, or even later inventions magnified to fill phantom centuries. The Crusades in question leave us with a haunting possibility that the wars which shaped the medieval imagination may not have been as vast, as devastating, or even as real as we are told. That once again, history's silence was covered over not by memory, but by invention. The knights of the Middle Ages are remembered as warriors of faith and honour, bound by chivalry, sworn to defend their lords, their lands, and their God. They march through history clad in steel, riding beneath banners emblazoned with crosses and lions. Yet when we look more closely, their story begins to blur. The nights we picture may be as much legend as truth, and within that legend lies another silence, the gap they seem to guard. A silence in the timeline, filled not with memory but with myths. Consider the most famous of them all, the Knights Templar. Founded in the early 12th century to protect pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land, they quickly grew into one of the most powerful orders in Europe. Their wealth rivaled kings, their influence stretched across borders, and their secrecy inspired endless speculation. But when we examine their origins, the ground grows shaky. Documents from their founding years are scarce, their early history written largely after the fact. Even their role in the Crusades is hazy, filled with grand stories of heroism that often lack material proof. Were the Templars truly a mighty order from their very beginning, or were centuries of power retroactively woven into their story to fill a gap? The same is true for the Knights of Legend, Arthur and his Round Table, Roland at Roncesvalles, even the crusading orders of Teutonic and Hospitaller Knights. Their tales are filled with impossible feats, wars that seem recycled from earlier myths, and heroes who may never have lived. Are these simply exaggerations of real warriors, or are they inventions designed to populate phantom centuries with noble defenders, guardians of an age that may never have existed? Knights also appear curiously anachronistic. Heavy armour, plate mail and Gothic castles supposedly evolve over centuries of warfare. Yet these leaps often occur suddenly, with little sign of gradual development, as if the technology and the image of the knight were not born of natural progress, but assigned wholesale to centuries in need of heroes. Could the knight, as we picture him, be less a product of history and more a symbol created to guard its silences? The Templars deepen the mystery in their end as much as their beginning. Supposedly dissolved in the early 14th century under charges of heresy, their sudden disappearance only adds to the sense of something hidden. Were they truly destroyed, or did they carry secrets too dangerous to reveal? Secrets perhaps tied not to treasure but to knowledge of time itself, knowledge of phantom centuries, of forged documents, of invented kings and empty years. If anyone guarded such a silence, it may well have been them. Even outside the orders, knights often appear in places they should not. Chronicles of battles describe armies of thousands of mounted warriors, yet the logistics of such forces are implausible. Archaeological traces are minimal. Were these accounts exaggerations, or were knights multiplied in the record to make wars seem grander, to fill centuries that otherwise lacked drama? The knight becomes less a soldier and more a symbol, a figure standing at the threshold of memory, guarding the illusion of continuity. Their shining armour reflects not just the battles they fought, but the stories written about them, stories that may have served as scaffolding to hold up centuries of silence. They were guardians, yes, but perhaps not of pilgrims or kings. Perhaps they were guardians of time itself, protecting the great gap by filling it with tales of valour and chivalry. To see the knight this way is to understand why his image endures. He is not only a warrior of history, but a warrior of myth, standing watch over phantom centuries. And behind his visor we may glimpse the truth, that sometimes history needs heroes not because they lived, but because their legend fills the silence where memory should have been. When gaps appear in one part of the world's timeline, historians often look elsewhere for continuity. If Europe endured its dark ages, perhaps China or the Islamic world carried the torch. If the West fell silent, perhaps the East preserved the voice of progress. Yet when we examine the history of Asia more closely, we find that they too contain fractures, silences, and suspicious overlaps. It is almost as if lost centuries were shifted eastward, moved across the map to balance the illusion of time, filling the silence of Europe with borrowed brilliance. Take, for example, the Tang dynasty of China, celebrated as one of the greatest golden ages in human history. Art, literature, science and philosophy flourished between the 7th and 10th centuries. The very same centuries Europe supposedly stumbled through darkness. But when we look more closely at the records, questions arise. Documents from the Tang are abundant, but many were compiled or recopied long after the events they describe. Their astronomical records, too, sometimes failed to align with the stars, as though shifted forward or backward in time. Could the Tang's brilliance have been displaced, assigned to phantom centuries to fill a gap elsewhere? The same pattern appears in the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliphate, with its fabled House of Wisdom in Baghdad, is said to have thrived precisely during Europe's missing years. It is described as the keeper of Greek knowledge, the preserver of science, the bridge between antiquity and modernity. But the deeper we look, the more elusive the evidence becomes. Many of the texts attributed to the Abbasid period survive only in much later copies. The original documents have vanished. Were they truly produced in the 8th and 9th centuries, or were they retroactively ascribed to that time to smooth the silence of Europe? India too offers puzzles. Periods of supposed intellectual flourishing, such as the Gupta era, seem to rise in suspicious synchrony with Europe's forgotten centuries. Their art and architecture appear fully formed, with little trace of gradual development. In some cases, dynasties overlap awkwardly with others in the region, their timelines stretch thin to fit a grander narrative of continuity. Could some of these centuries have been shifted, adjusted to ensure that while Europe slept, Asia shone brightly enough to maintain the illusion that civilization never faltered? Even Japan's history raises questions. The early imperial chronicles, written centuries after the events they describe, extend the lineage of emperors far into the past, creating a continuity that may be more symbolic than factual. The same centuries missing from Europe are filled with myth and legend in Japan's records, later polished into historical narrative. Were these centuries real, or were they invented to ensure that Japan's imperial line appeared eternal? This shifting of centuries across the globe may not have been deliberate collusion, but the natural result of chroniclers trying to reconcile fractured timelines. If rulers in Europe added centuries, then historians elsewhere may have adjusted their own chronologies to match. If phantom years were inserted into the calendar, then Asia's histories had to stretch to fit, creating the illusion that while one region fell silent, another thrived. In reality, both may have been victims of the same distortion of time. The Asian connection reminds us that history is not a collection of isolated stories, but a web. Pull on one thread in Europe, and the fabric shifts in China. Stretch centuries in Rome, and the timeline must adjust in India. Add phantom years to Byzantium, and Japan's emperors suddenly inherit an even longer line. The manipulation of time in one part of the world inevitably ripples across the rest, leaving behind a patchwork that looks whole only because its seams have been hidden. And so we are left with the haunting question: were Asia's golden ages truly where the timeline places them, or were they shifted eastward to mask the silence of Europe? Were entire centuries displaced, moved like pieces on a board to create the illusion of an unbroken story? The chronicles shine brightly, but behind their light lies the same silence that haunts the West, a silence that suggests time itself has been rearranged. Deep within the ice of Greenland and Antarctica lies a record untouched by kings, scribes, or empires. Each year snow falls and compresses, forming layers like the rings of a tree. Within these layers are trapped traces of the world as it was, dust from deserts, ash from volcanoes, bubbles of ancient air. Unlike parchment, stone, or memory, the ice cannot be forged. It preserves time itself, year upon year, century upon century, frozen in silence. And yet, when scientists drill deep into the ice and read this record, they uncover troubling contradictions. The ice does not always agree with the history we are told. According to our textbooks, great events should leave scars in the frozen record. Massive volcanic eruptions, for example, should scatter ash across the globe, marking the ice with dark bands that can be counted and dated. But when scientists look for these scars, some are missing and others appear in places they should not. Eruptions described in chronicles leave no trace, while eruptions recorded in the ice do not match the years assigned to them in history. It is as if centuries have been shifted, or as if entire events have been misplaced in time. One of the most famous puzzles is the great volcanic eruption that supposedly darkened the skies in 536 AD, plunging the world into years of cold and famine. Chronicles from Europe and Asia describe the sun dimming, crops failing, and entire kingdoms collapsing. Yet the ice cores do not always agree on when this event occurred. Some evidence points to the mid-6th century, as described. Others suggest it may have happened decades earlier or later. Could this be the result of phantom years, centuries added or deleted, shifting the event out of place? The same problem arises with plagues. The Black Death, said to have killed millions in the 14th century, should have left chemical traces in the ice, declines in carbon dioxide as fields lay fallow, shifts in methane as population collapsed. And while some changes appear, they do not always match the scale or timing described in the chronicles. Was the devastation exaggerated? Were the dates wrong? Or were whole centuries misplaced, making the scars in the ice appear out of sync with the written record? Climate itself becomes a witness. Warm periods and cold periods, recorded in tree rings and ice cores alike, often fail to align neatly with our timeline. The so-called medieval warm period, when Europe supposedly flourished with longer growing seasons, and the Little Ice Age, when frost gripped the continent, appear distorted when matched against the frozen record. Are these mismatches the result of natural regional differences, or do they point, once again, to centuries that have been shifted, stretched, or erased? The ice does not bend to politics. It has no reason to lie. Yet when its story conflicts with the chronicles, we are told the ice must be wrong, or that our interpretations are flawed. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more unsettling. Perhaps the ice is showing us the world as it really was, and it is our history that has been rewritten. Imagine standing at the edge of a glacier, the ancient ice groaning beneath your feet, knowing that beneath the surface lies a timeline far older and far truer than any book. Each layer is a whisper from the past, a frozen memory that cannot be silenced. And those whispers tell us something our histories refuse to admit. That time, as we know it, has been tampered with. That centuries may not lie where we think they do. That the gaps in our story are written not only in silence, but in ice. The frozen record is not perfect. It too is fragile, subject to interpretation. But in its depths lies a truth no ruler can erase, a truth that challenges the story we have been given. And if we choose to listen, it tells us this: history is not what we remember, it is what remains, and much of what remains is missing. Above us, beyond the drifting clouds and the turning seasons, the sun keeps its own rhythm, not just in its daily rise and fall, but in vast cycles of energy, patterns of brightness and dimness, of storms and silence that leave their mark upon the earth. These solar cycles are as old as time itself. They are etched into tree rings, imprinted in ice cores, and even remembered in ancient myths of fire and shadow. Unlike kings or scribes, the sun cannot be bribed. Its clock is eternal. And yet, when we compare this cosmic clock to the timeline of human history, the patterns do not always align. Once again, we find the whisper of missing years. Roughly every 11 years, the sun moves through a cycle of solar activity, flaring and dimming in a rhythm measured by sunspots. Over centuries, longer patterns emerge: grand minima, when the sun falls into quiet, and grand maxima, when it burns with unusual fury. These cycles leave their fingerprints in carbon 14 levels in trees, and in beryllium trapped in polar ice. When we match these cosmic fingerprints to history, we should see harmony. But instead we see fractures. One of the most famous solar events is the Maunder Minimum, a period of unusually low sunspot activity between the mid-1600s and early 1700s. It coincides with what we call the Little Ice Age, bitter winters, failed harvests, and frozen rivers across Europe. The match is striking, but when scientists search further back, they find other minima and maxima that do not align as neatly with recorded history. Climatic events appear in the cosmic record centuries before or after the dates given in chronicles. Could the mismatch be evidence that centuries have been shifted, phantom years stretching the calendar so that the sun and history no longer agree? The Aut minimum, for example, appears in the solar record around the 11th century, suggesting a period of cooling and quiet. Yet the chronicles of that time tell of wars, crusades, and flourishing kingdoms, with little mention of climate disruption. Did historians overlook it, or have those centuries been displaced, their true position in time obscured by edits to the calendar? Even myths seem to echo the cosmic clock. Ancient cultures spoke of suns that vanished, of skies dimmed, of days when the fire of heaven grew weak. The Chinese recorded suns that rose and set more than once in a single day. The Maya tracked solar cycles with precision so great that their calendar stretched thousands of years into the future. These stories, these calendars, should align with what science now knows, yet often they do not. Their prophecies and alignments seem to belong to ages earlier or later than we expect. Were they wrong? Or are we reading them through a distorted timeline where centuries have been misplaced? The sun does not forget, its cycles are unbroken, repeating long after empires have fallen and chronicles have been burned. If the cosmic clock and human history do not align, then one of them must be wrong. And the evidence suggests it is not the sun. This realization is unsettling because it strikes at the core of what we trust. The calendar on our walls, the centuries in our books, the ages that define civilizations, all of them depend on alignment with the heavens. If solar cycles reveal centuries missing, then our history is not only fragile, it is fractured. The sun remembers what we have forgotten, or what we were never meant to know. To look at the cosmic clock is to glimpse the true measure of time, beyond politics, beyond power, beyond invention. And what it shows us is silence, silence where centuries should be, silence where memory should rest. The cosmic clock ticks on, indifferent to human lies, and in its ticking, it whispers the truth. History has been tampered with. Legends are often dismissed as stories, the echoes of imagination rather than history. Myths, we are told, are the dreams of civilizations, parables, metaphors, poetry woven into narrative. Yet when we listen closely, many of these myths begin to sound less like fantasy and more like fractured memory. Tales of floods, fire from the skies, vanished kingdoms, and gods who once walked among mortals repeat across cultures separated by oceans. How can stories so similar arise in places that never knew each other? Perhaps because they are not merely stories at all. Perhaps they are records, distorted, symbolic, but still records, of centuries we have forgotten or erased. Myths may be the memory of the ages that no longer exist on the calendar. Consider the flood stories. From Mesopotamia's Epic of Gilgamesh to the Hebrew Bible, from Hindu scriptures to Native American legends, cultures across the world speak of a great deluge that swept away entire civilizations. Mainstream history reduces this to metaphor, or at most, a memory of local flooding. But what if it recalls a real event, a catastrophe large enough to reset the clock of history? If phantom centuries exist, might they not have been covered over with myth, the only vessel capable of carrying memory through silence? Atlantis is another whisper. Plato described it as a mighty empire destroyed in a single day and night of catastrophe. Scholars dismiss it as allegory. Yet echoes of a lost, advanced civilization appear in countless traditions. The Mayan memory of past worlds, Hindu accounts of cycles of destruction and rebirth, the Norse tales of Ragnarök. Different names, different details, but always the same theme. A great age, ended and erased, leaving behind only fragments. Could these myths remember a civilization displaced from our timeline, cut away from history but preserved in story? Even the tales of gods may carry hidden timelines. Sumerian myths speak of the Anunnaki, beings who descended from the heavens to guide humanity. The Greeks told of Titans and Olympians, warring across ages before men were born. The Maya recorded cycles of suns, ages of creation and destruction stretching far beyond the few thousand years our calendars allow. These myths are not random. They are structured, ordered, bound to cycles of time. If they are pure invention, why do they align so eerily with cosmic rhythms, solar cycles, precession, floods, and cataclysms etched in ice and stone? Perhaps because they are fragments of the same truth, carried forward in symbols when dates were lost. Legends also often carry suspiciously precise numbers. The reigns of gods measured in thousands of years, dynasties of kings lasting impossibly long. Scholars dismiss these as exaggerations. But what if they reflect an earlier chronology, one that recorded time differently? What if, beneath the numbers, lie the lost centuries hidden from us? Myths may not count years as we do, but they remember them. In their vast spans of time, we may glimpse the shadow of ages cut from the calendar. It is easy to laugh at myths, to see dragons, gods, and magical kingdoms as fantasy. But if we strip away the symbolism, what remains are stories of civilizations erased, disasters that reset the world, and ages that no longer appear in history. Myths may be the only record we have of those centuries. They are not lies, but memories. Memories encoded in story, because story can survive when parchment burns and stone crumbles. To hear a myth is to hear the voice of the forgotten. It whispers not just of gods and monsters, but of real events displaced in time, hidden from the calendar, remembered only in story. The myths that remember are not fiction. They are the echoes of timelines erased. And if we listen closely, they may tell us more about history's silences than the chronicles ever will. What would 500 missing years truly mean? Not simply a blank in the books, but a whole age concealed, an era of lives lived, battles fought, discoveries made, and civilizations rising and falling, now erased from memory. If phantom time is real, then between the familiar centuries of our timeline, there lies a forgotten age, hidden in plain sight, its traces scattered in ruins, myths, and silences. The question is not only whether such an age existed, but what it might have concealed. Imagine first the people, whole generations whose names are gone, whose stories never reached us, farmers who planted crops and watched the skies, builders who raised monuments now assigned to the wrong centuries, poets whose verses never made it past the flames of history. These lives would not have been less real simply because they were erased. They would have been as vivid, as rich, as fragile as our own, now dissolved into silence because their centuries were cut away. What civilizations might have risen during that span? Could there have been empires we no longer recall, kingdoms whose traces lie beneath layers of soil and time, their memory preserved only in the faintest legends? Perhaps this forgotten age explains the architectural mysteries scattered across the world, structures too advanced for their supposed era, temples and cathedrals that appear out of nowhere, technologies that seem misplaced. If the missing years were real, then those monuments may not be anomalies at all. They may belong to a civilization erased with its century. The forgotten age might also explain the sudden leaps we see in knowledge, mathematics and astronomy that appear fully formed as though handed down from nowhere, languages that evolve too quickly with gaps that suggest whole chapters are missing. Even religion itself may carry shadows of the lost centuries, prophecies timed to events that never happened, lineages extended to cover phantom years. Was divine destiny shaped not only by faith but by an edited calendar? Then there are the disasters. Every timeline speaks of floods, plagues, famines, and wars that came without warning, reshaping the world. What if some of these belong not where they are placed, but to the lost centuries? What if the climate events preserved in ice, the alignments written in the stars, the myths of cataclysm preserved in story, all point to a vanished span of time when the earth itself convulsed? A forgotten age of fire and shadow, erased because its memory did not serve those who rewrote history. The silence of this age would not be empty. It would be heavy, filled with the weight of what was taken. Imagine 500 years of innovation, of art, of human struggle gone. Imagine all the lives whose memory now rests only in nameless bones beneath the earth. And imagine how different our present might be if those centuries had been preserved. We might live in a different world entirely. Our year, our calendar, our very sense of where we stand in time could be centuries removed from truth. Perhaps the most haunting thought is that fragments of this forgotten age still surround us. A monument that seems out of place. A myth that feels too precise to be fiction. A star alignment that does not fit the year. Each fragment is a whisper, a reminder that the past we are told is seamless, maybe stitched together from patches. That beneath the fabric of history lies an entire age, deliberately hidden, waiting to be remembered. The forgotten age is not just about lost centuries, it is about the fragility of memory itself. If half a millennium can vanish, then nothing in our timeline is beyond question. The years we think we know may be no more secure than the ones already erased. And in that realization lies the most unsettling truth. Our entire history may be less a record of what was and more a story of what was allowed to remain. Across the world, stones rise in silence. They stand in deserts, jungles, and windswept plains, monuments older than memory, defying time itself. Some are temples, some tombs, some enigmas whose purpose has long been forgotten. And yet, when placed within the official timeline of history, these stones do not fit. Their age is uncertain, their builders sometimes unknown, their sophistication beyond what the textbooks allow. They whisper of centuries unaccounted for, of knowledge displaced, of a story deeper than the one we have been told. This is the silence of the stones, the voice of monuments that defy the timeline. Consider first the pyramids of Egypt. We are told they were built around 2500 BC, masterpieces of engineering that appeared suddenly at the dawn of civilization. But the Great Pyramid's precision is staggering, its alignment with true north, its mathematical proportions, its massive stones fitted so tightly that even today we struggle to replicate them. If Egypt truly began here, then it began with perfection, followed by decline. Later pyramids are smaller, rougher, cruder. Why does greatness come first rather than last? Unless the Great Pyramid is not of the era we think, but a survivor from an earlier age, an echo of centuries now erased. In South America, the silence grows louder. At Sacsayhuaman in Peru, stones the size of trucks lock together in seamless walls, their surfaces smoothed, their angles complex. At Tiwanaku, near Lake Titicaca, massive blocks lie scattered as though from a lost cataclysm. Their precision suggests advanced knowledge, yet they are attributed to cultures that left no writing, no wheel, no explanation of how they could have achieved such feats. Did these monuments truly belong to the civilizations we credit them to, or were they inherited, remnants of a forgotten age? Stonehenge in England raises similar questions. Its alignment with the solstices is undeniable, its stones transported miles across rugged terrain. Yet it is often described as a simple ritual site of prehistoric farmers. The official timeline places it in a vague prehistoric age, yet its astronomical precision rivals that of later observatories. Was it truly built in the time assigned to it, or is it the remnant of an age we no longer remember, an age cut away by phantom centuries? Across Asia, the stones whisper again. In India, temples carved directly into cliffs, like those at Ellora and Ajanta, appear with such artistry and scale that they seem impossible to have emerged suddenly within the narrow span assigned to them. Their precision and scope suggest generations of accumulated knowledge, yet no clear evolutionary path leads to them. As if they belong to a continuity we cannot see, a stretch of centuries missing from our record. Even the Easter Island Moai stand as witnesses to silence. These giant statues gaze inland, their purpose still debated. Their scale suggests a complex society, yet by the time Europeans arrived, their society had collapsed, its memory scattered into myth. How many centuries of history lie buried beneath those statues, forgotten in the silence of time? The stones are not silent by accident. They are silent because they cannot speak in words, only in presence. And yet, their presence contradicts the story. They endure when the chronicles fail. They stand when the parchment burns. They show us that civilizations capable of astonishing feats existed, but do not fit neatly into the timeline we have been given. If centuries have been erased, the stones are the survivors. They remain where time tried to hide them, monuments to a forgotten age. Their silence is not emptiness, but resistance. A reminder that history may bend, but stone does not. And in their endurance lies the proof that the story of humanity is older, stranger, and more fractured than we dare admit. History is not only the story of what we know, it is also the story of what we do not know, what we cannot see, what has been hidden from us. Beneath the surface of our textbooks lies a silence that stretches across centuries, swallowing whole civilizations, erasing rulers, disguising monuments, and bending time itself. We chase the past as though it is fixed, but the truth is fragile. It has been written and rewritten, guarded and concealed, edited and rearranged. What remains is not the past itself, but a version of it, smoothed, curated, incomplete, and the silence still lingers. We have walked through missing centuries, phantom kings, plagues that may never have happened, wars that left no scars, and monuments that do not fit the time assigned to them. Each mystery is unsettling on its own. Together they form a chorus of questions too loud to ignore. If so much of history does not align, then what else might be false? What else might be invention, layered over gaps too dangerous to leave empty? The silence of the past is not just absence, it is design. That silence matters, because it shapes who we are. The stories we are told about our origins define us. They tell us where we came from, what our ancestors believed, what struggles they endured. If those stories are fractured, if centuries were added or erased, then our identity rests on shifting ground. We may be living not in the year we think, but in the year centuries removed from truth. The silence of the past echoes into the present, shaping how we see ourselves, how we trust authority, and how we imagine the future. Perhaps this is why the silence remains. Knowledge is power, and the control of time itself may be the greatest power of all. To erase centuries is to erase accountability. To invent centuries is to invent legitimacy, to guard forbidden archives, to hide inconvenient documents, to overwrite memory with myth. These are not accidents. They are acts of control. And as long as that control remains unchallenged, the silence will endure. Yet silence is never absolute. The stones still stand, the stars still shine, the ice still records, myths still whisper. Even in the face of erasure, traces of truth remain, waiting for those willing to look closer. The past is not entirely gone, it is hidden, waiting for eyes unafraid of what they might find. This is why the search matters, not just for historians or scholars, but for all of us. To question the timeline is to question power itself. To confront silence is to reclaim memory. And to wonder whether centuries have been stolen from us is to recognize that history is not fixed, it is fragile, and it belongs to us as much as to those who wrote it. As we close this journey, remember this: history's silence is not empty. It is full of the stories we were never meant to know. The missing years still haunt us, not as shadows of the past, but as reminders of how easily truth can be hidden. If the past still hides, then so does part of who we are, and perhaps that is why these questions matter most of all. If this journey has stirred something within you, if you feel the weight of these mysteries as I do, then don't let the silence win. Stay with us. Watch the other stories we've uncovered. Share your thoughts below, because your voice becomes part of the search. Like this video so that others may stumble upon these questions. Share it with those who still believe history is seamless, unbroken, unquestionable. And most importantly, subscribe. Join this community of seekers, of dreamers, of historians in the night who are not afraid to listen to the silence and ask what it means, because the silence of the past remains, but together we can make sure it will not remain forever. The past is still whispering. The silence still remains, and the questions we've uncovered tonight are only the beginning. If this journey moved you, stay with us. Watch more of our stories. Let the mysteries of history carry you deeper. Subscribe to Bedtime Historians so you never miss what comes next. Like this video if it stirred something within you. Share it with those who dare to wonder. And add your voice in the comments, because every question, every thought brings us closer to the truth. The silence is powerful, but together we are louder.